led from being an atheist to a chaplain, a minister and a chaplain, and doing these God workshops in the woods. I thought that was really interesting. So I discovered also that he has this really nice book, which is for sale at our bookstore. And if you bought one, you can have him sign it after the meeting. Yes? Renewal in the Wilderness, you better don't. A spiritual guide to connecting with God in the natural world. And so I think you'll find it really interesting how this all came about, and we're looking forward to hearing the story. Please give a warm welcome to John Lionberger.
Thank you. I'm going to take my jacket off. I just can't do this with a jacket on.
She wanted me to dress up, but
we won't hold it against you. Okay. I'll be over here a little bit so we can get you. Okay. If you don't want to do much.
Wardrobe. Boy, that's a good mic. Wow. When I preach at Three Crowns, I'm used to what I call a tonsil mic, that you have to kind of put that part down your throat so you can be heard. This is a great mic. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I've never encountered a group like this before. I was telling you, I met a neighbor. She lives right across the street from me, and we didn't know it. Julie in the back row. I was telling her that I have never encountered a group like this where it is possible for me to share stories that I have never shared with anybody. Maybe I could do that later. I don't know if I want to begin with that. But what I'd like to, some of the stories I heard from the people who were here during the early session said things that really resonated very deeply with me. I've never had what I would call a near-death experience. I've come close to death because I've done some stupid things and some wonderful things that have put me in death-defying situations, but I've never had that white light moment. But I've had a number of moments of unexplainable things that have happened to me, and I hadn't planned to really talk about this, but things that the first one I remember, for instance, was when I was at camp up in Michigan, and I was kind of unaware of where I was walking, and I walked across an active archery field. Yeah, I told you I did stupid things, right? Well, I was 11. What are you going to do? So I walked across this active archery field, and it was as if a hand shoved me down to the ground. And that's something I've never heard anybody talk about before, so you're hearing it first. I really have never told this story. I've told my wife, and that's it. And a hand shoved me down, and I heard the story like this here today, so I feel comfortable sharing this with you because I think you will understand that this is not a woo-woo experience. Things like this happen. And the moment my head went down, I heard this whoosh of an arrow right where my head had been. So there were other experiences like that of God's presence. That's what I choose to call it, the guide's presence, whatever you want to call it. But let's go on to how an atheist becomes a minister. Well, I'll tell you right at the beginning, it proves unequivocally that God has a sense of humor. And it's an ironic sense of humor, and it's a wry sense of humor, because I come from a professional family. My father was a doctor and a scientist, and very German. So you put all those together, and you've got somebody and from Missouri, I can't forget that, the prove-it-to-me state. So, if you can't prove it, it doesn't exist. And I keep thinking, I was sitting here listening to the stories, thinking about my father and how he'd react to some of these stories and some of my own stories, which he never ever knew. And so I came from this kind of family where it had to be proven, and I grew up with this and kind of adapted to it, adopted. And then I began having these experiences that I could not explain. And it was really quite incredible. But my family went to church, and I think because it was nice to be seen in church. As a doctor, you need to be seen as a pillar of the community. It was in the 50s, so everybody went to church whether they believed in something or not. And to this day, I have no idea what my parents believed. So we went to church, and I will tell you, and I don't know about your church experience if you had them. My church experience was if you needed an antidote to, what's it called when you can't go to sleep? Thank you. My church was an antidote to insomnia. It was just boring. Our minister had these big puppy dog eyes. You know those velvet paintings? The big eyes that follow you around? That's what his eyes were like, and he kind of glided on clouds of piety. And he never seemed to make he wasn't human. And the God he portrayed, and the Jesus, because I went to Christian church, the Jesus he portrayed were something that no young, well, I shouldn't say no young person, but this young person simply couldn't identify with. And so as soon as it was within my capacity to not go to church, I stopped. And I became probably an atheist, but I called myself an agnostic because I was hedging my bets, just in case. So, I need to look at my notes because I've got an hour and a half to talk, and is that right, an hour and a half?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to leave any of this incredibly interesting story out. And to do this, I had to go back to my ordination paper. So there was nothing spiritually remarkable about my life. My father was distant and stern and humorless, and if God was supposed to be my father, imagine how much more profoundly distant, humorless, and stern God would be if my father was that stern. So I just wanted no part of it. And I got to the point that I pitied people who felt a need for God, pitied people who went to church. I had no need. I had no desire for it, so I just ignored the whole thing. But I married a very spiritual woman, so figure this one out. She is now a Presbyterian pastor, and she is constantly astounded that I have made this transformation in my life. So we have incredible talks around the dinner table. I kind of felt that, like Elvis, God had left the building. Where had he gone? Or where had she gone? And I hadn't a clue, and frankly, I really didn't care, at least on a cognitive level. I think somewhere down here I did. But on a cognitive level, I really didn't care because my life was going just fine. I was in the broadcasting business. I was doing incredibly well. I was making lots of money. I was pretty much happy. Not totally. Who's ever totally happy? But I was doing very well and being professionally rewarded for it, both monetarily and in promotions and all of that. So I was having a pretty good time in my life. But as many of you might understand, as you go down life's glide path, I became less and less fulfilled by my work. I invested so much in my work. And I didn't get back what I invested. And I don't know if this rings a bell with any of you. And around 50, I entered what I would call a midlife crisis because I was, as I said, I was doing well, but I wasn't being fulfilled any longer. So my wife, who knows me and loves me, called an organization called Outward Bound. And let me ask you if you've heard of that, and do I need to explain that?
No.
Anybody? Do I need to explain what Outward Bound is? Yeah. Okay. Outward Bound is an organization that uses the wilderness as a training tool, mostly for kids, but they also take adults. And what they do is they take people into the wilderness to show them that their boundaries are self-imposed, and that how they define their lives does not have to be how they define their lives. Because the wilderness forces you to forget what your boundaries have been and open yourself up in ways that you simply will not do, most likely, in your civilized life, because you've got you've got all of these preconceived ideas, and you kind of put yourself in a box. And I suspect you know what I'm talking about. So the wilderness erases those boxes and erases those boundaries, and you suddenly begin to see that while you can go through this keyhole, you expand into a room that's just voluminous, and you become a much bigger person as a result. So my wife called Outward Bound, and she said, "What's the hardest trip you've got?"
Excuse me.
And the man at the end of the phone said, "Excuse me, we've got a bad connection here. I thought you said the hardest trip. People ask about the easiest trip." And she said, "No, I want the hardest trip you've got." And the guy said, "Well, okay, it's dog sledding in February. The temperature at night gets down to 40 below at least, maybe colder, but our thermometers stop at 40 below. And we sleep outside. Sounds pretty easy, or it sounds pretty hard, doesn't it?" She said, "Yes." So she said, "Sign him up." When she gave me this for my birthday, remember I'm in a midlife crisis. So she gives this to me for my birthday, and if I ever doubted my wife's love for me, it was erased at that moment, because for whatever sick reason, I love experiences like that, because as Outward Bound knows, you find out who you are by testing yourself, by pushing your boundaries, by pushing against the edge, by getting uncomfortable, not necessarily on purpose, but in this case it was on purpose. And so it was fantastic. So I walked into this Boundary Waters experience with these huge and gorgeous dogs, with I think 11 other people, and I was there strictly for the experience. I was not there to find God. I was just there for the adventure, and maybe to find some way out of my midlife crisis. Although I really hadn't given that a lot of conscious thought. So we went off, and the word dog sledding really is kind of a misnomer, because while there is one dog sled, it's a huge cargo sled. And if you're familiar with the Iditarod, that's kind of what everybody had in their minds. So, standing at the back of a taut racing sled with 8 willing dogs, and you yell out, "Mush!" and they shoot off down these icy paths at about 25 miles an hour, and it's exciting. What we did, this cargo sled had 600 pounds of gear on it, and so the people who were mushing the dogs had to take off their cross-country skis and just kind of get their shoulders behind the sled like this and push it with their shoulders, while the skiers skied in front of the dogs and cleared the path for the dogs. Still an awful lot of fun. Well, I like dogs a lot, but not so much I want to push the sled for them. So I spent my whole time on skis. And about the third day, as we got used to what we were doing in the wilderness and the cold, and believe me, it is profoundly cold, but very handleable. Is that a word? I don't know. I just made it up. Very handleable with the right clothes, and God, it's a lot of fun. And if you've ever been to the Boundary Waters in the summer, or the spring or the fall, the winter time up there is spectacular, because almost nobody's there, if you can believe that. And it's just pristine and you know how fresh snow looks when it falls on your trees, and the sunlight comes out, you've got a disco ball in your backyard with all the sunlight coming off the trees and all the sparkly snow. Imagine acres and acres and acres of that up to your hip. It's just incredible, and it's so quiet. And really the only sound you can hear are the ravens and the crows and the jays, and sometimes the wolves howling back and forth to each other. It's just gorgeous. So on the third day, a woman who unfortunately thought she had prepared for this trip dropped her backpack in the middle of a frozen lake and skied on. She just could not carry this backpack any longer. So I volunteered when we set up camp to go back and get her backpack, because I love, first of all, being in an environment like this, and to be alone in an environment like this. So I volunteered to go back and get it, and it was close to dusk. You know, the shadows were lengthening, and the shadows were turning purplish, And so I had to hustle my bustle to get there and then get back before it got dark, because you don't want to be out after dark if you can avoid it. So I took off with a whistle, if I needed it, water, and just my skis. I left my backpack and went and got hers. Well, I found her backpack in about 20 minutes, and I thought, you know something? How often in Chicago do I get a chance just to be in a quiet, gorgeous, pristine place like this? And so I just stayed there for a few minutes. And I looked around, and there's something called an anorak that's kind of a full, comes down to there. It's got a big pouch like a kangaroo in the front. And I looked at the thermometer on my anorak, and the temperature had dropped 25 degrees in the past hour, so it was about 25 below. And I could feel the fangs of the cold beginning to come through my clothing, but still I didn't want to move because it was such a powerful, powerful moment. And so before I put the backpack on and headed back, and I don't know why I did this. To this day, I can't explain why I did this. I think Diane would say my guides had me do it. I like that explanation. So my guides had me raise my arms like this with my ski poles dangling from my wrists, and I'm standing there with no human being within roughly 2 miles of me. So I stand there like this, I throw my head back, and my ski poles are dangling at my wrists, and I stare up at the sky. And suddenly there was this sense of intense warmth. It's like I was standing in a shower of warmth. I felt wet with this warmth. And I didn't move, but I couldn't explain it. And it felt like I was in a path of perfection. Julie and I were talking about this. How do you put words to an experience like this? Words are limited, and I still grasp for the words to explain it. And I thought, my God, am I having a stroke? Am I having a heart attack? What in the world is going on? And so I looked at my feet to see if there was meltwater at my feet, because it did feel warm and wet. And I looked down and there was nothing. And so slowly I let my arms come back to my side, and there was this gathering kind of snowball of a thought in my mind. And I said, as it gained form, I thought, no. And I kept pushing it down until finally it came full-blown to my lips. And it was basically, is it God? And I said, oh no, please, I don't want this. I don't need it. It can't be God. I'm too much of a heathen. And so when I skied back to the tent, it was a big slab-sided cook tent. I came back late. It was dark by that time, and it was still a beautiful night. And I could see the tent glowing from the internal lantern on the inside. And it was this beautiful, ruddy yellow glow against the dark night. But I never told a soul about it until I got home and I told my wife. And I really didn't tell anybody about this for about a year, because for a year I wrestled with this. And put yourself in my place. You're at least an agnostic and probably an atheist, because the impulse I had after I wrestled with it was go into the ministry. So now this is where I want you to put yourself in my place. How do you go from being an atheist to going into the ministry? It's a real sea change. I mean, it's a 180. But it just wouldn't go away. And so I was sitting in the Evanston Library. I can't remember why. And you know those long reference tables that are slanted like this? You know the one I'm talking about?
Yeah.
I was sitting at one of those reference tables, and I just mentally and spiritually and in my heart and soul was wrestling with this. And I just kind of put words to it with my lip sync. And the lip sync simply was, what am I going to do with this? And just like that, and I think this group more than any other I've ever told this story to is going to understand this. The answer, and it was an audible voice to me, the answer was pretty much, you idiot, take people to the wilderness for what you got. And I stood up, and I shoved the chair back, and I went, yes! And the librarian said, no, no. And they may have escorted me out because I'd made so much noise. But I walked out doing fist pumps from that library because I knew I had found something that fit me like a glove. And I'm not talking about the OJ glove. I'm talking about a real custom-made glove. And I knew it was going to set the course the rest of my life, and something I could do for the rest of my life. But that's not, obviously, the end of the story. Then I was confronted with, okay, now I've decided what I'm going to do, so where do I go to seminary? What seminary is going to have me? Because I have too many issues with God. I have too many issues with organized religion. I have too many issues with so much of this stuff, so where in the world am I going to go to seminary? What church am I going to go to if I have to go to a church? What church would have me? What seminary would have me? So I did find a seminary that let me cuss at God and scream at God all I needed to do, and it took me 5 years to go through, but I went through seminary with the whole idea of doing this renewal in the wilderness thing, to take people into the wilderness for what I found. And frankly, I don't know how much you know about the Bible, but I'm going to assume, well, I won't assume anything. But when I found out how steeped in the wilderness experience the Bible is, and the Quran, and the Talmud, and so many other religious tracts are in wilderness lore, I was a little ticked off because I wanted it to be completely my own. And that lasted for 3 minutes. And I thought, you know something, that's really stupid, because think of the tradition of going to the wilderness to seek a spiritual side of you that you simply cannot find in a more civilized setting. So, let me stop here and ask you if you have any questions.
How old were you?
How old was I? Well, when that happened, I was 50. And it was about 52 when I went to seminary, about 58 when 58, I can't remember, I'm too old. When I graduated. So I've been doing this for about 7 years. 8 years. Yes?
What seminary accepted you?
Chicago Theological Seminary. It's United Church of Christ Seminary in Hyde Park. And they really, I'll never forget one experience I had in chapel during preaching class. And every sermon I had done in preaching class was basically taking God to task for what I perceived to be God's failure in living up to the covenant of, being with us through the times of trial. Because there are many examples of, as everybody knows. And at the end of my last sermon, the professor said, "John, that was a really good sermon. But your language, not your language, but your body language and the tone of your voice did not match the acid of your words. Would you like to really say to God what's on your mind?" I said, "Really?" I said, "Yeah. Are you comfortable doing that?" So I said, "Sure." And I used language in chapel that should never be used in chapel. It was really cool. And it was so healing to just get that out. And he said, the professor said, I think God likes honest criticism more than God likes dishonest sucking up. And those were his words, not mine. So it was a really wonderful moment. But it scared the living daylights out of a lot of people, including me. Shall I go on?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Why?
What?
Why did it scare people?
Why did it scare people? Well, I think people are often raised not to tell God exactly what they're thinking or feeling. I certainly was raised that way. Excuse me. So it's not part of what I think most people do. Excuse me a moment. So it's not a very natural thing to do, in my experience. I don't know, do you have an easier time yelling at God? Whoever said that, I can't see in the lights. Yes? Okay. Yes.
This is my belief. I believe God knows everything you think. You don't have to tell God anything.
Mhm.
I mean, it's there. It is all what it is, and I feel having to tell God is really telling yourself what you're thinking. Maybe that's what made you feel good.
I think it is. And just being honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think God wants you to be authentic. It's just my theology, but I really think God wants you to be authentic with yourself, with other people, and with God. But that's my theology. Yes?
Yes, sir. Most seminaries require recommendations or endorsements by a couple of clergymen in good standing of that particular denomination. How did you manage to accomplish that?
Are you suggesting something?
I'm just suggesting that are you suggesting that there was some miraculous intervention here?
If from God or from kind clergy? Well, to answer your question, you mean to get into seminary?
Yeah.
I had enough clergy friends who understood where I was coming from, and they were very honest with the seminary about all the doubts that I had and the issues with organized religion I had. And the seminary took me anyhow. So it was incredible.
Maybe you were refreshing.
I'm sorry?
Maybe you were refreshing.
I hope so. Thank you, I appreciate that. And I walked through the threshold of the seminary the first day that I started school, and I looked up, and it was one of the, you remember this morning how dark and ominous it looked? It was a day like that, and I looked up and I said, okay, God, if you're going to do it to me, you better do it now, because I'm walking in otherwise. And nothing happened. Nothing happened. So here you are. So anyhow, shall I go on?
Yes.
Okay. I went through seminary in 5 years. I worked full-time and went to seminary part-time. And then I thought, you know something? If I continue to do this, I'm going to be 60 when I graduate. And who knows, is my body going to hold up? So I retired. I love to say that. It feels good to say that. But I retired, went to seminary full-time, and spent time in Alaska learning how to take people safely into the wilderness. I knew a lot, but there was a lot more to learn, and the seminary allowed me to do that. And then I came out with the idea of starting Renewal in the Wilderness, which is the ministry or business, I've never known which to call it, I prefer ministry, taking people into the wilderness for what I found. And there has never, on my trips, I don't think anybody has had exactly the same experience I've had, but they've had remarkable experiences, equally remarkable for them as mine was for me. I've had Jews of many kinds, Christians of many kinds, Protestants, Catholics. I've had Protestant ministers leaving to go into Catholicism. I've had Catholic priests leaving the priesthood to marry. I've had Buddhists. I've had a lot of atheists, which I just love. And as you would expect, that's my favorite group because I know what can happen. And to my knowledge, only one of those atheists or agnostics has not come out spiritually affected by this because it's that powerful. Excuse me. What I discovered is, and I know how this is going to sound, but what I discovered is through my own trips that I've done, and then when I was asked to write this book, and the research that I did, I've discovered that this experience of God, or something bigger than we are, or the guides, or whatever you want to call it, is so universal and so ancient that if people today could take the rites and rituals, or just the experience itself, and go back 6,000 years to the Middle East, or from 500 years ago from the Inuit in Alaska could go down to somewhere in Central America with the Quechua Indians, or the Hindus could take it to Japan, or I mean, you just go all over the world, and the experience is exactly the same. And as I was hearing some of the stories here this afternoon, I was thinking, my God, the experience of a near-death experience, as I understand it, with the white light, is one of those experiences that is universal. It cuts across every religious and social boundary that I know of. And help me with this. Is that a correct assumption?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. Well, that's the same thing that I've discovered with this spiritual experience in the wilderness. And it's led me to believe that if we could all have this experience of spiritual renewal in the wilderness, I think we could all sit down and talk about God using a common language, and we wouldn't have to shed blood in the process. And I know how that sounds, but I think it's that powerful. So, I do take people into the wilderness. I don't want this to be a commercial. I don't think you want a commercial. But it's an amazingly powerful experience, and it affects almost everybody. Not everybody, but almost everybody. In varying degrees. Some people just really have a good time. Other people have an explosive time. In an explosive time, I mean in the best possible sense of the word. And I think a lot of it is because what happens out there is, if I use the word barnacles, does everybody know what a barnacle is?
No.
No? Okay. Barnacles, in the sea, there are these mollusks called barnacles. And they attach to a ship's hull. And they're really hard, they're like clams. And they attach to a ship's hull, and there is anti-mollusk or anti-barnacle paint, but even that, after a while, loses its efficacy, and the barnacles attach to the hull. And when they've finished with the hull and the rudder, and if it has a propeller, then they start building barnacle colonies, condos, basically, one on top of the other. So to get the boat back to the shape it was, going cleanly through the water and efficiently through the water, the owner has to put the boat in dry dock and chip it off, blast it off, whatever. Well, like these boats, we human beings acquire a lot of baggage that we don't really intend to carry. And as we get older, the things that we tend to carry, we begin to think are absolutely indispensable to our lives. Things like PDAs, iPhones, MP3 players, filofaxes, computers, phones with all these neat things on them. Give me some other things. What else do we think we absolutely have to have?
TV.
Television. Computers. Did I say computers? Okay.
Cars.
Cars. Well, yeah. Yeah. Microwaves. You name it. Meetings. My gosh, the list goes on and on and on. And I can't speak about you, but I can speak about myself. When I let myself get weighed down by these things, I feel like this. And I'm like one of these ships, one of these boats, with just loaded with barnacles that I don't need. And I go from being a really clean-hulled, sleek, efficient craft to being a garbage scow or a barge. A barge is a better analogy. So what the wilderness does is it helps us scrape off these barnacles and gets us back to what we were meant to be. And because we often go through life, and again, I'll speak about myself. I tend to think the things I want are the things I need, but I really don't need much. I don't think most of us need an awful lot to be profoundly happy. And so that's what, for a short period of time, happens on these trips. And people get their priorities rejiggered. They understand that there are other things out there that can make them just incredibly happy, and life does not have to be as complicated as as we in society make it. And so people just have these really epiphanous moments. But again, that may be a word I just made up. So our trips, well, again, I don't want this to be a commercial. I just want to explain the experience to you. So let me stop here and ask you if you have any questions.
Yeah.
Yes?
On your trips, how
the difference as to where you're going. But when you're talking about the Alaskan trip, how long was that?
Well, that Alaska trip, for me, was a month, backpacking through the mountains around Mount McKinley.
And when you take people now, do you have different durations or?
We do. We have, excuse me, we have 7 and 8 day trips, and everything we do is canoeing or kayaking, because mostly the people who want to do these trips are middle-aged, and they've lost their Olympic conditioning a few years ago. And you don't have to be in great shape to do these trips. And you can carry a little, well, actually you can carry a lot more gear. And you see incredible beauty that just floors you. And I say this with some hesitation because it's such an overused phrase, but in a canoe or a kayak, you can go with the flow. I mean, it is true. You can go with the flow. So you move at nature's pace, and I love that. And when people are put together in a canoe, in particular, because those are always dual, or almost always, people get to know each other. And when you go through a shared experience like that, you get to know people in ways that even their best friends may not know them, or their husbands or their wives. And so it becomes a really unique experience. So we do 7 and 8 day trips, we do 3 day trips, and we do 1 day trips. But the 1 day trips are just really the whiff of the cork in terms of what the possibilities are. I saw one other hand back there.
Right here.
Yes.
I have had an experience. I grew up in Peru, and the nuns used to make us have a silent street at least twice a year, and through that I learned the wilderness in our heart. Because nothing happened on the first day, nothing happened on the second day, after the third day. But there was a lot of friction among, human beings, because we are all different and unique. So what is it that you have, but then the blessing comes through within. What is it that you have seen? Because there is a lot of friction among different people, our
Right.
uniqueness. So
Right.
can you elaborate about that and how does it come to be versus nature, what it does to each individual?
Well, if I understood did you hear the question? No. Okay. The question was, how do we avoid friction? Am I saying that correctly?
No.
No.
How do you go about it? Because we all are very unique, and then there is something going on outside, and there is something going on inside the fire.
Yes.
Such a dynamic. So after which day, how do you deal with those?
Okay. All right, let's see if I got it this time. The question is, everybody has very unique things going on within them that can conflict with themselves, and also, and I'll add this, and can conflict with the people who are also on the trip. Did I say that correctly?
Right.
Okay. Well, I can't control what goes on within them, and I don't want to. So I don't think I can answer that part of your question, but the part I can answer is how we control differences among people is that when I send out a packet of information to people who request it, one of the pieces of information is, or not information, it's just something that's very important to me as a covenant. And it simply says, there probably will be people from different faiths on these trips, or very different beliefs than yours, and we are all here for the same reason. How we get there is between you and God. And so I promise I will not proselytize. I will not proselytize. And if they won't sign it, I won't take them. Because it's very, very important to me that this be a trip that's open to everybody, without judgment from everybody or from anybody on the trip. So when we get together, we talk about that again. If there are people from different faiths, we negotiate a way to talk about spirituality and our brand of spirituality, and it's a negotiated process so that as we go through the time we're together, we have a common platform, I guess, to discuss it. Proper, or not proper, but a language that we can use. Does that make sense?
So you put an intention.
I'm sorry?
So that's the intention.
That's very intentional.
Yeah.
Right.
Because if there is no intention, then nobody can agree to it.
Right. So, I mean, it's very important to me, given my background as a recovering atheist, that people just really respect where everybody is on that journey. And it's very different, one person to another. But so far, a big one on that, so far there's been no problem. Anybody else? Yes?
Do you think as we get more and more city and less wilderness, that these kind of experiences, spiritual experiences you're talking about, are going to be harder and harder to come by?
Yes. I also am deeply concerned that as people get so imbued with city living and the comforts of city living, that they're going to say, and they do, they're going to say, why would I give up my bed? Why would I give up my toilet? Why would I give up my shower for 6 nights or 3 nights? You know, that's one of the major problems I face in renewal in the wilderness. And yet, I don't know, what's your reaction to spending some nights on the ground or doing some physical activity? And I don't think I want to hear, but because I have a sense of what you're going to say. Yes, it is different, but that's the whole idea. It's different, because what do you learn if you're doing the same thing over and over and over? How do you let, I feel like I'm on a soapbox here, but how does God get into you if you do the same thing over and over and over? I think you've got to do something different for spectacular things to happen. And it's not that it can't, I mean, let me ask you this. If you don't meditate, when was the last time you had an extreme experience, spiritual experience, watching television? See what I mean? Did you?
Well, I was watching Out on the Limb on television. It's a book, there was a book that they made into a television play. Shirley MacLaine's experience down in Peru.
Yeah.
And it was very spiritual, and it did feel very important.
Yeah. Well, I'm not saying it can't happen, because I know it can. I mean, I had that experience in the library. I was not doing something on the edge, but I had that experience in the library. So I know it can happen, but generally, it's not going to happen in your easy chair. I mean, we as human beings, I think there's something in our DNA that says, well, let me ask you this question. I'll go back to you. When you see pictures, and often I have a slideshow, and the reason is I want people to get into the frame of and the reference of nature's beauty. And when people see these, often they have this sense of, God, that's just gorgeous. And it takes them, just seeing it, just the picture of it, takes them to places of simplicity and a sense of release and a sense of renewal. Just seeing these pictures. Is that your experience too? Or when you see actual places of great natural beauty, do you have that sense that, wow, and a sense of unburdening? Yes? Yes. Good participation. Yes? Yes. Thank you. Well, that's what this is about. And I think, that's why I said, I think this is in our DNA to be in places like this. There's a book by a man named Richard Louv called The Last Child in the Wilderness. And it is about how we protect our kids from wild things, from wild places. And so you know the incidence of ADD and ADHD and allergies and all the increases in all of these things. Well, Louv postulates, and I think he's right, that if we expose our children to nature and get them outside and away from their Game Boys and their television and their computer stuff, that they build up immunities, ADD and ADHD not disappear, but they're greatly helped. There's also a substantial body of evidence that says people in hospitals who have views of even just treetops recuperate much faster if they just have urban scenes or they look at a wall outside their windows. There's just something in us that requires this. Julie?
Yeah, I think just to kind of add on to what you're saying, when you're away in nature, it's sometimes easier to hear your own rhythms than to hear the rhythms of the streets, you know, the people around you. And so I think just to kind of, you might have already said that one. forgot what.
You said it beautifully.
Yeah.
Thank you. You're right. It just slows you down. Do you feel your lives are rushing? I do when I'm not in the wilderness. But do you know what I mean? That there's just too, if you have I have 10 pounds of things to do in a 5-pound bag to do it in. There's another saying that goes with that. I've changed it to be clean. But you know what I'm talking about? There's just something about being in a place like that. You're just moving suddenly at nature's pace instead of, oh my God, I've got 15 minutes to do 18 things. And it's really wonderful. And people feel renewed. I'm up on a soapbox, aren't I? I can sense that. Yes.
My question is, if a husband and a wife wanted to do it, do your trips, do you think it's preferable for them to do it separately?
No, not at all. I think it's, I won't say preferable, but they're absolutely welcome to come together. It's such a shared experience. I mean, for instance, I'll throw this out to you for affirmation, but when I have really incredible experiences, how do you go back and tell somebody who's never had that experience? You can put words to it, but the words lack. They miss something. So if you share the experience, you can say, you remember that sunset? Oh yeah, God, that was gorgeous. Or do you remember those moons? Yeah, that was fabulous.
Well, I wanted you to say yes, but I was thinking maybe you had found people had a better, I don't know, coming experience with God if they did it on their own. So I just
No,
wondered.
I have not had that experience. And I don't know if I said this, if I did, repetition is not a bad thing. What I really love about this is that even if atheists who come on my trips, or agnostics, they may not ascribe what they feel to God, and I really don't care. But they do admit, at the conclusion of the trip, that they finally understand that there's something bigger than they are out there. And that's good enough for me. My job is not to convert people. My job is just to expose people to the possibilities of what can go on out in a natural place. And it's important and I often forget to say this, I'm so proud I remembered to say this. You can get a lot of this walking through your local park or walking around your block. If you do it with a willingness to be surprised and an open mind and an open heart. A lot of what I've talked about is very much available to us in almost any natural place. There's a gorgeous park near my home that I often go to when my mind is on spin cycle. And I just sit and watch the ducks and the geese, and never a loon in that park. And I just watch the birds and just let nature go at its own course. And I walk out of there and I feel a lot better. So it's very open to almost anywhere you want to be outside. Yes?
I really like that idea because there's an organization around here called Chicago Wilderness.
Yes.
And they have just started a program called No Child Left Inside.
Oh, good. I had not heard about that.
Yeah, and they're just kind of developing that program. It's actually a national program, and Chicago Wilderness has taken it on in this area. But if anybody subscribes to their magazine or anything, it gives a lot of places where you can go and get into a place where you can do walking meditation, all kinds of things in a wilderness-like setting where there's acres and acres, and often not many people around, if you get away from like the main bike trails and that kind of thing.
Right. That's wonderful. And I hope they have it for adults too, because, I mean, so often we concentrate on the kids, but what about us? What about us? Don't we deserve some of that? Wouldn't you like to go back to camp if you went? I mean, does that bring back wonderful, maybe it doesn't, I don't know. But if it does bring back wonderful memories, don't we deserve more of that as adults? I think we do. Yes?
When I was a child, about 9 or 10 years of age, our family moved into its second house, which was not far from the forest preserves in Des Plaines. So all I had to do was walk down the block, cross River Road, And there I was in the forest. And this was before people thought of the evil people that could be waiting in the forest to grab a child or an adult and do horrible things. And my most happy moments or times were when I was walking in that forest, discovering what was there. I found a tree that instead of the branches growing upwards, they curved down to form a half shell, which was so beautiful to me. And the ponds, and there was a open place like a meadow, and that to me became my sanctuary. I was horribly bored, like you said, with church. It had no relevance to me. Sunday school seemed to be condescending to the person that I felt that I was. It was too childish. And every Sunday when I was awakened to go to church, and I go, oh, here it is Sunday again, all I wanted to do was instead go to the forest and be with nature.
Absolutely. Did you hear that? Yes, no?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. That was, yes, you're right.
Yes.
And I'm not taking, I'm at the point in my life that I like going to church, but that, as you know, was not my earlier experience. I finally found a church, and a series of churches I like a lot when I'm not preaching, but thank you. Yes, you're absolutely right. John Calvin said, and he was a real starchy theologian, and I don't like a lot of his theology, but he said nature is God's cathedral that God built to show us that he exists, or she exists, or it exists. And I believe that. Yes?
Getting back to your personal experience in life. One, what phase of broadcasting were you in? I'm curious. And two, a person can have a spiritual experience and not yet turn to God. So what was it, the incident in the library when you felt what you heard was God, or was there more to it? I didn't really understand how you came from, atheism is pretty strong to belief.
Okay, I was in the sales and marketing side of broadcasting. At one point in my career, I worked for Ted Turner, and I brought the cable news network to the Midwest. I've got a lot of stories about working for Ted, if you want to hear them. Interesting, fascinating man. And my God experience was really, that's a very interesting question. I think in the wilderness, on my wilderness experience, the dog sled trip, I knew it was God. I just didn't want to say it was God.
It was too awesome.
It was too awesome and too antithetical to 50 years. Well, I don't think at 5 I was an atheist, but 40 years of saying this is, who needs it? So it took a while for me to get to the point that I was comfortable saying, I think it was God.
So it was gradual.
Yeah. I don't know if you've heard the story of the David statue that Michelangelo carved, that gorgeous statue. The story is that other sculptors tried to make something out of this very flawed piece of marble and then gave up. And Michelangelo spent a year walking around it, running his hands over the marble, getting a sense of what was in the marble, and just chipping away only what needed to be chipped away. And I think that's kind of to reveal the sculpture and the David that was inside. So I think that's what. I think that's kind of what happened. Yes.
Can you talk more about that experience in the wilderness? Like, I know it's hard to articulate because it's more feelings, but the warmth and what were the sensations? Was it kind? Because I read near-death experiences and they know everything sometimes when they have the experiences and.
The request was that I talk a little bit more about that feeling of warmth at 25 below. I'm not quite sure what to add to that. Excuse me. It was a surprise. It was, yeah, I feel like I was ambushed in retrospect, and I mean that in the best possible sense of the word ambush. And I think there's a good side to ambush. But it really felt, it was almost from the inside out. It was, I don't know, I hesitate to use the analogy of a coal, a burning coal, except a nicely warm coal, not just a burning coal, but it just felt like my entire body was warm at 25 below, and it felt wet as well, and noticeably wet. I really thought maybe it was raining on me somewhere. It was a feeling of perfection, a feeling of bliss, a sense of, and again, this is a hackneyed phrase, but a universal connection. I just felt completely tied in. And I've had that experience, that feeling of being completely tied in, probably 4 or 5 times on various trips. And they are, I don't know if you've ever had an experience like that, where you just feel that in this world, in this existence of ours, that there is no better place for you to be for however long that feeling lasts. And oh my God, what a feeling that is. It's just astounding. Yes?
Can you tell us what you talk about during your ministry?
At the retirement home or on the trips?
Both.
Okay, well, whoa. Well, I try to, when I try to preach, I try to preach the universality of this experience, of the experience of God, rather than necessarily from a Christian point of view, except, they're all so much alike when you come right down to it. So I try to capitalize on the similarities rather than the differences. And frankly, that's what I do on the wilderness trips as well. And so often the talks come from the people who are doing the trips, because they begin to talk and they begin to explain what's going on for them. And so often there's not much that I can add to it. But what we try to do is what we try to do is keep it on track with being open to the experience. And most people are really good at doing that. And I don't know that I'm answering your question. I don't know. Anybody else? How about at 4:30, right? Okay. Oh, I'm really good. It's 4:28. Other questions? One thing I didn't tell you, and I think this is important, and I'm sorry I forgot to tell you. On all of my trips, they're in every religious tradition that uses the wilderness, and that's most religions. In every one of these religious disciplines, there is a period of solitude and silence. And we do that on our trips. If we're taking a week-long trip, the goal is to have 24 hours where you are alone with a journal and shelter and clothes and rain gear if it rains, and bedding and food and water, and that's pretty much it. And for 24 hours, you get to spend all of this time with yourself and with God, and it's tough. I don't know if you've ever tried it. I've done it maybe 15 or 20 times, and I reach a point where I think, okay, I've walked around my space, I've set up my camp, I've got everything perfect, now what do I do? And boy, that's hard to deal with. What do I do? Because we are so geared, I guess is the word, to doing things. But now, when you have nothing to do, you're supposed to be. And it's hard to go from a doing to a being, sometimes, for most people. And most people are afraid of this, and they say so on their questionnaire when I ask them, what are you most concerned about this trip? Well, I'm more concerned about being alone for 24 hours than I am of the animals. But afterwards, most people say, that was incredible. incredible. Once I got over that hump, I've never had 24 hours where I was just alone and doing nothing except being.
They call it depression if you do it at home.
And I don't know if you heard that, but I think you're probably right. She said they call it depression if you're at home and doing nothing and just being. And you might be right, yeah. Or non-productive, a slacker. Yes, ma'am?
In the healthcare field also, you're talking about the beings. We are a human being, not a human doing.
Exactly.
And we get the priorities mixed up.
Yes.
And this is what you're talking about, getting back to being the human.
Exactly, exactly. I don't know if you heard that?
No.
She said, thank you very much. She said, in the healthcare practice, we try to get out of being human doings and become human beings again, which is the point I was trying to make, but you did it better. Anybody else? Okay. Oh, yes.
Oh, I was wondering, you said your wife was spiritual while you were an atheist.
Right.
And she just sort of let you alone and did you understand what I'm asking you?
Oh, yes, I do. Oh, yes. She pretty much did. Much to her credit, because I know it bothered her a lot. That I had no use for God, I had no use for church. And increasingly, as she went down life's glide path, she needed it more. And so she'd go to church and I'd go off on a bike ride. So yeah, it bothered her. But she was wise enough to let me work it out myself. And when I told her I was going to seminary, have you ever seen manhole covers? That's about the size of her eyes. You are what? So we've had a lot of very interesting conversations. Well, thank you so much. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry for the question. When you heard that audible voice in the library, did it feel like, or did it sound like it was coming from across the room or from like within yourself?
Very much with, well, can it do both? Because it didn't sound like it was just echoing in my head. It sounded like it was over me. I had, I told you at the beginning, I've had other experiences like that. One of them was something like that. I was driving up, I lived downtown, I had a blind date with my wife. I hadn't met her. It was a blind date, and it was going to be in Edison. And as I was driving up the outer drive and turned onto Hollywood, there was I know how this sounds, you guys will understand this. I don't tell this story often. There was a flash of light in the car, in the cockpit, just a really powerful flashlight, and a voice said, "This woman will be important to you." And I knew within an hour I was going to marry her. So how do you explain this stuff? Who understands this? I think you do. You probably understand why I don't tell these stories very often. Because, well, for obvious reasons. Coming from my German, Missouri scientific family, who would understand that? Not my father. I tried to explain it to him. He looked at me like, oh my God, my son's gone to the loony bin. All right. Oh, yes, ma'am.
I was just going to tell you that I had a similar experience of a voice talking to me, and it was outside my head, because I turned around to look, who's there, and I was in bed in the morning, and I didn't tell anybody for like 10 years, because it's such a startling experience and unexplainable that if you try to explain it to somebody, you feel that they're going to think you're crazy.
Right.
So I think most people don't say anything.
Right, exactly. When we had breakfast this morning, I asked how the scientific community was now treating near-death experiences. And Diane said, actually, they're doing research to try to prove it scientifically that it happens, which is a light years from where it was years ago, I think. Good for them. How many people in this room have had these near-death experiences, white light? Because at breakfast there weren't that many. 2 or 3. So the rest of you are here why?
Speeches like you.
Oh, you too? Or do you want to answer the question?
I think a lot of people have similar experiences where they will experience the white light or the voice, but they haven't had an actual near-death experience, which
Yeah.
has been my case.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't think you have to come nearly to death to have an incredible experience like that. And I think there's a book somewhere that needs to be written about how your life has changed as a result of your experiences. Yes, ma'am.
Are there other stories that you don't normally tell that you're ready to tell?
There is one other. Let's see, we've gone through the arrow experience, turning. There is one other. God, don't get to be my age. It's just hell. Well, it's there, but I'm not coming up with it. I'm sorry.
While you're thinking, are you familiar with the radio show Coast to Coast?
No, it's Coast to Coast radio show? No.
Okay. At 12 midnight, Art Bell's, well, it used to be Art Bell, now it's George something. But oh my, they have all the paranormals and all the, they love your story.
They would?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, he might even, I don't know, if you write him.
Yeah.
It's all about the paranormal and.
AM, FM? Is it AM or FM?
AM, FM?
Oh, it's on WLS,
Okay.
and it goes from midnight till 4 in the morning.
Okay.
They
Yeah, I've never been called paranormal before. Usually subnormal, but
It's called Coast to Coast, and every evening it's different, but and they have near-death experience people on. They have every kind. People that have had seen ghosts, talked with them. Most,
yeah.
the
Wow.
paranormal.
No, I've never heard of it. Never heard of it.
Coast to Coast.
This is well, it's not self-promotion. I just want to tell you that PBS is going to do something on renewal in the wilderness, which I've just found out about. You're the first group I've told, which I'm very excited about.
Doing something
On renewal in the wilderness, what I do. So I don't know when it's going to air. I don't know how long it's going to be, but I'm very excited about it. Yeah, so very cool. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if you had any children, and if you do, have they been partaking of your experience or the renewal experience, wilderness experience?
Well, I won't take anybody younger than 14 because they need to have a sense of personal responsibility for a period of solitude and silence because they are left alone. And to be very honest with you, children are not my favorite group. I'm not too old to herd cats, but I don't enjoy it much anymore. So I prefer adults, but I do take children once in a while. Self-limiting, I know that. But and to answer your question, yes, but it takes them longer. I took 20 freshmen in high school a few years ago for a week. It took 4 days for them to have any sense of this is what we do. And how they got to this place was through some fierce thunderstorms. And their first question when they saw these clouds, and I've never seen clouds like this anywhere, they were ugly beyond belief. And these kids came up to me and they said, the Rangers know where we are, don't they? They're going to come and get us, aren't they? And I said, we're just, here we are. We have no house to go to. We can't flip a switch. We are exposed to the elements. And these kids were transformed by these 2 really powerful thunderstorms. And the second one, and we sat out in the brunt of it because we didn't want tent poles erected around us because the lightning was so fearsome. So they sat for almost an hour and a half in this incredible thunderstorm. Flash, boom, all around us. And these kids just sat there and endured this, and it was so cool. And I mean, take it for what it is. I mean, it's scary, but once you get over the idea that well, you could die. I mean, yes, of course you could be struck by lightning. That is a possibility. It's so remote. And we took every safety precaution. But in the second storm, which was the next day, instead of cowering under their ponchos, these kids started singing in defiance. It was very, very neat. And at that point, they made the shift. And there's something, you know, I talked about the outward bound experience of expanding your horizons of who you are. That was their outward bound experience. It was really, really wonderful. Yes?
I know Outward Bound, for example, has a lot of defined tasks or things where they specifically push people to find their boundaries and expand their limitations. And the Native Americans, for example, have a vision quest that actually there's a lot of those that you can go out west and do those, which is the same kind of thing. You're alone in the wilderness, you know, with your water and your blanket, basically.
Right.
So how is your experience different from those?
Well, a vision quest is usually 4 days. And you have no water, no food, no tent, no shelter of any kind, and you are put usually in an elevated place, and elevated places, as you know, are where what lightning likes best. So we differ from a vision quest in those areas. Because, well, you know, we only have, for the week-long trips, we only have 6, 7, or 8 days. So we do a 1 day. It's still very powerful. They do have food, pardon me, and water and shelter and yada, yada, yada. But they're completely alone. And we talk about vision quests, and we talk about, I should have mentioned this story. How much time do I have? Because this is a wonderful story.
15 minutes.
15 minutes? Okay. To your point, this is a wonderful story, I think. We go through life with expectations, don't we? I mean, I do. We all do. And a lot of expectations are good. How do you expect yourself to be in society? What expectations do you have of yourself? How do you expect society to treat you? And it helps us define, in many ways, who we want to be. So, those are not bad, but I think when you have expectations of how you will experience God or your guides, or all those synonyms for God, then we limit ourselves because, in my experience, if we expect to see God, and I'm just using this as a metaphor, but if we expect to see God like this, can you see this? But God comes to you like this, you're going to miss this completely because that's how you expect to see God. So there was a man, this is a Rio Grande canoe trip. It's a week long down in Texas. It's early February. It's desert, but the flowers are out and the cactus leaves are succulent with this moisture that's been falling. And there's this man named Frank, 68 years old, and he said to me when he signed up for the trip, he said, "John, I have never had an experience of God. I'm 68 years old, the clock is ticking, I want to have it on this trip." And I said, "Frank, I can't promise a thing. It's between you and God." And so through the week, Frank talked to the group about it, said basically the same thing. He said, "I want to see the burning bush, I need to see the parting water, where is it?" And so we went off on our period of solitude and silence, and when I put Frank in his place, I said, "Frank, just be open to whatever comes to you." Because to your point of vision quests, the whole idea of a vision quest is, and the Native Americans would send their young people off and say, the Great Spirit can come to you as a thunderstorm, or it can come to you as an earthworm. You have to be open to virtually anything that happens, because it can be any of those and anything in between. So I told the whole group that story about the vision quest. So Frank went off, we all went off. It's a holy time. It really is a holy time to spend 24 hours by yourself for the purpose that we were there. It's a holy thing. And I was concerned about Frank. I was concerned about everybody, because that's my job, to be concerned. But I was particularly concerned about Frank, because I really wanted him to have some experience. He came back, we came back in silence, and Frank was, have you ever seen a 5-year-old kid who has to go to the bathroom? You know, they're standing there, they're kind of going, oh, like this, you know, their bladder's killing them. That's how Frank was, and he didn't have to go to the bathroom. And we sat down in a circle, and Frank put his hand up, and that was against protocol. But he put his hand up, and I said, Frank, you got something to say? He said, yes, I think I saw God this morning. Whoa! So, Frank had the floor. Well, he had the dirt, but he had the floor. He said, I was sitting up on this bluff, looking at the Rio Grande, looking at the sun come up and lighting these ox-blood red cliffs, and seeing the nighthawks disappear and the sounds of rocks falling and all of this. And I was thinking, I still haven't had this experience. When is it going to happen? And then I heard a sound down here at my belt. And he pointed at his belt just like I'm doing. And I need to stop and tell you that, you know, wilderness clothing is usually pretty muted, earth-tony kind of stuff, you know, if you've seen it. Frank was wearing a bright red Hawaiian shirt. You could pick the guy up from 2 miles. So Frank was, he said, I was standing there, sitting there, watching the sun come up, and I heard this whirring sound right down here by my belt. And I looked down, and it was this glorious, tiny, iridescent hummingbird that far from my belt, that far from this flower right here on, you know, at my waist. And for 30 seconds, this bird hovered at my waist, deciding if I was nectar or not. And ultimately, it flew away. And Frank got really quiet for 10 seconds. And he looked at the river, and then he looked back at us, and he said, now how can I say I saw God in that hummingbird? And then he got really quiet for 15, 20 seconds. And then he said to us, but how can I say I didn't? So what he did was strip away his expectations, and he had his vision quest. It was. I get goosebumps every time I tell that story. I still do. So, and the sad part of the story is that Frank died 3 years later. But Frank had his experience, and I think he had more as well because his eyes were opened to the possibilities. So I love that story. I'm sorry Frank is dead because he is a remarkable man. But he had his experience, and I'm just so grateful he did. Does that answer your question? That's a long explanation for a short question.
Yes, I think so, and I was just kind of wondering, you know, about what makes your going on your trips like unique. For example, because like yesterday, I noticed here when I got here that you have a Kishwaukee River one-day trip, and I spent yesterday kayaking on the Kishwaukee River, and I had, you know, a couple of I had an experience where I almost died, and
yesterday?
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, and I could have very easily, but my guides were there, and everything was fine, and I was just kind of in awe of that, and there were raptors on the river, and I thought anybody can do this, really. You know, what would I get from having a guided sort of tour? What would make that different as an experience?
I think what would make it different would be the intentionality of it. I don't know if you define what you had happen yesterday as a spiritual experience. And everybody's definition of what spiritual is, I'm sure, is as different as their spirituality is. Excuse me. But in the mornings, sort of to answer your question, it's a loose structure because I think we're so overstructured in our lives that we need spaces for these things to happen. So I try real hard not to overstructure things. But in the mornings, we had guided meditation to make us aware of the present, which is when God comes to us. And God will come in the future, but the present is all we have. for that experience. And that's something, that's a skill you can take back with you in your civilized life. And so we have a guided meditation, and it is always around experiencing the moment and being aware of your surroundings. And then I'll ask a question of the day. That if it's a week-long trip, there are 6 or 7 questions, and each of the questions is meant to take you deeper and build. I know that sounds like an oxymoron. How do you go deeper and build? But you do. To build on the, I guess, complexity or the depth of what the previous day's question was. And then we'll talk about it at night, or sometimes not, because other things come up that are equally or better than the question I had asked. And then the days just unfold as they will. And the intention is to, and if I said this, forgive me, did I say that each day is intended to have a period of solitude and silence and wandering the islands that we're on and just alone time? Did I say that?
Yeah.
Yes? Okay. Well, it doesn't always happen that way, because sometimes the weather precludes it or prevents it, and sometimes just the travel distance and the necessities of setting up camp and cooking and cleaning up preclude that. But the intention is to do that, and probably 3 out of 4 days, 3/4 of the days have that built in. So that's what makes it different than just a wilderness adventure.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Yes?
During the trip, when you all separate into your 24-hour period of solitude, approximately how far in distance are you from one another? Would one person be able to see where another one has camped in the distance, or not visible to one another?
The question was, how far apart are people? Can you see each other? This is on the period of solitude and silence. The answer is depends on the topography, the geography of where we are. The ideal is that nobody will see anybody. It often doesn't work that way, but we try to make sure that they're far enough apart they can't. I mean, we ask people, please don't talk to each other. Don't try to signal to each other. The idea is to be alone. So sometimes you just can't prevent people seeing each other because the only usable space is fairly small. But the idea is to give people an area roughly the size of a basketball court, that if they want to walk around it, and pace, because there's a lot of good meditative chanting you can do with pacing, also with paddle stroking, actually. But in the boundary waters, sometimes we'll use 3 or 4 islands. So people can see these little tiny people, and sometimes they can see the headlamps or the flashlights during the night, but that's really it. And everybody has a whistle, and the universal sign for distress is 3 blasts, and whistles carry over water like you cannot believe. And so I check on them once or twice during the 24 hours just to make sure they're okay, but that's the only human contact they have. Anybody else? Yes?
This is something interesting. Vice President Humphrey, in '67, set up a camp for 400 inner city kids from Washington in the wilderness area in Maryland. They were rowdy, you name it, the 400 inner city kids. I had the good fortune of going there with my microscope and show them germs from their mouths and what else there for public health and hygiene standpoint. As you expanded their experiences of life, there was a transformation that nobody could believe. Within one day, they saw things they never saw before. And then they began to open up and around these campfires, talk about their inner things that had been bothering them all their lives. They were about 13, 14, 15 years old. Question they had, we can never perceive they had. One child was concerned about, I am never going to get married. So why? because childbirth is so painful. I don't want my sweetheart to go through that. Those were their inner things that they couldn't talk to anybody. But the experience of seeing things under the microscope, as you expand their experience and horizons, that day the camp counselor was saying, you might as well go home. Everybody's washing dishes, brushing their teeth, washing their hands, beds are made. They don't need us anymore. So as we expand our experiences, either in the wilderness or within the wilderness that lives within us, I think we transform. So what you're doing is marvelous in the sense that we need to get out of our boxes. If you can do it in a park, in our offices, or anywhere, but we need to get out of our boxes.
Exactly.
And never forget that experience that
Right.
did for these people.
Thank you. Did you all hear that? Oh, that's too bad. That was gorgeous. This gentleman said something about Hubert Humphrey establishing a wilderness camp for inner city kids. And you took a microphone, right? It was a microscope. And you looked at the germs?
Yeah, from the mouth.
Germs from the mouths of kids. And as these kids' wilderness experiences expanded their lives, they talked more and more and more in depth about what their lives were like, and their lives got bigger through their experiences. Did I say that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. So how do I disagree with that? I don't. I think what, for anybody who can do this, and it doesn't have to be true wilderness, but I think what can happen if you go to a park or walk through your neighborhood with open to surprise and an open heart and an open mind, it can take you from the limits of the possible to the limitlessness of possibility. And there's a difference. Possibility is a huge thing, but the possible is what we limit ourselves to. Yes?
We are still doing it in Chicago. This thing has become a huge project, hopefully someday.
Oh, good.
Where we want children and adults to see their lives unfolding through science.
Fantastic. Good. Wonderful. Thank you. Well, the clock on the wall, I love that. I feel like a radio announcer. Well, the clock on the wall says it's almost 5 o'clock, and Diane is coming to get the microphone. The battery only has 1 bar left, so I'm probably through. Thank you very, very much.
Having you here. And if you have any further questions, I'm sure you'll be glad to answer them. Or sign books. I think somebody may be in the back still selling the books, hopefully. So,
Of course, it's a wonderful book.
Of course, it's a wonderful book. So, thank you again. And don't forget, next month we have Kimba Aram, who is from Hawaii. She's a sound healer, and she will be working with her instruments. A delightful young lady, and I hope you won't miss her. So, join us.